remarks, let us not forget, in amongst the talk of commercial agriculture, that in Crimea and in many of the countries of the Black Sea, there is a very large, very dominating sector of very small farmers who farm farms of a few hectares, and often less than 1 hectare. That is true in Crimea. It's also, for example, true in Georgia. Now, that sector supports a large part of the population, and the United Nations Development Programme as an organization is principally concerned with that sector, because in that population that farms of that size, we find a lot of the poverty in the countries of the Black Sea region. So what to do about that? Now, this is the dead spot of the day, and I'm not sure what I did to the organizers to get the last lot of the day. So I want to argue something that goes against much of the thinking that we hear in the region, including in Ukraine. And that is to argue that, in fact, the movement of labor out of agriculture is, in fact, a great opportunity for the transformation of that small farming sector. Nothing happens. That's it. Now, if we look at the statistics are very obvious. Ukraine is no longer a rural country. That the people have gradually, since 1960, have moved out of rural areas, and as a result, Ukraine has become largely an urban country, approximate halving of the rural population. Now, if we look at sorry, this slide is a bit small. If we look at the relationship between the labor force in agriculture and agriculture's contribution to GDP, gross domestic product, we see that Ukraine is something of an outlier. And if we go down to the bottom of that table, we see that countries with a strongly commercial agriculture, Canada, UK, and the Netherlands, the ratio between the agricultural labor force and agriculture's contribution to GDP is about the same. It's about 1 to 1. 1% of the labor force, 1% of GDP. But if we go to the Ukraine, we see that agriculture contributes about 16% of GDP, 16% of the labor force and 8% of GDP. Now that tells us immediately that labor productivity in agriculture in Ukraine is still pretty low. And if we look at the outlying countries, all post-socialist countries in the top 3, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, we see an even bigger ratio between the labor force and the contribution to GDP, which tells us labor productivity in agriculture is low. Now, in fact, what we almost certainly see is, however, rising labor productivity in Ukrainian agriculture, despite that imbalance in the ratio. I haven't got direct statistics on that because they're hard to find, but in 1999, 74% of rural income went on food. Now, internationally, if households spend more than 60% of their income on food, we regard them as being poor. Okay, so in 1999, Ukrainian households spent 74% of their money on food. They're clearly doing better because by 2005, and I'm sorry this is a bit out of date, the statistics, that had fallen to 60%. In other words, they'd got 40% of their incomes to spend on other things. They were satisfying their food requirements from 60% of their income. People are getting better off. People are moving out of rural areas. People are moving out of agriculture, and people again are generally getting better off. Those are 3 facts. I don't suggest causality, but there is a remarkable coincidence if it isn't causality. Now, why should we not be worried about people leaving rural areas? It's something that many people are very concerned about. They say, look, we are a rural population. People are leaving rural areas. That's a concern. We don't want to see that. Now, why is it really not such a big concern? Now, the first move is usually not to the capital city. In other words, not everybody is flooding into the capital city, leading to social dislocation, slums, overcrowding, whatever. Usually the first move is to a town nearby. not the capital. The second fact from international evidence is that people move with strong expectation of a job. They already know they have a pretty good chance of getting a job. They don't just go on chance. They know from their contacts that they can probably get a job and that that job is going to pay an income which is higher than the one they're getting at the moment. And it's also rational for them to move because they're moving to a higher income than they were getting in rural areas. So people move from rural areas to urban areas with a reason, and they move to improve their income. Now, within this movement, we also see daily commuting as a very common pattern. It's very unusual that for the first move that the whole family goes. Usually one family labor, one family member will commute or will move on a temporary basis, either weekly or monthly or for a season, and then they come back. So in fact, the whole family is typically not leaving the rural areas. Now, and I'm sorry, the slide is very small print. Why is this a benefit for everybody? A benefit for both the towns and for the cities? Now, what evidence seems to suggest, and what we've seen in our programs, is that as the cities grow, we see demand from rural areas for raw materials from the countryside. That there is a growing demand for agricultural produce. And that increases rural incomes. And once rural incomes grow, that creates a growing demand for the products which are produced in urban areas. That in turn leads to the growth of jobs and of enterprises in urban areas. Okay, so we have a beneficial effect from rural growth on urban growth. And as those companies grow and as jobs are formed in towns, that creates a demand for labor from the rural areas. So the towns are growing, the rural areas are growing too. We have a beneficial relationship. Now, what does this mean in terms of agricultural policy? It probably means a number of things. First, if we want the rural population to benefit from the urban growth that gives them jobs, one of the biggest constraints that the rural population faces is skills. If I live in a rural area, if I live in an agricultural community, I probably haven't got the skills to get me a job in urban areas. I can get myself a job as a cleaner, I can get myself a job maybe as a waiter, but I can't get myself a skilled job. So one of the options in terms of policy is to say, all right, people from rural areas don't have the skills to get an urban job. Let's, as a matter of public policy, let's give them those skills through training. Now that's hard for many governments to swallow. It's very hard to say to a government, all right, let's train people in order they can migrate. That is a policy prescription that is extremely hard to sell to a government. But in fact, it's likely to lead to substantial economic benefits. Instead, we see policies which seek to retain people in rural areas. We had a policy such as that in the European Union for a number of years called the least favored areas policy. It was a failure. Despite all the expenditure, people did not stay in rural areas. The other policy that has caused great excitement, but has usually failed, is the policy of trying to take jobs to the rural areas. That has typically involved very high expenditure and has largely failed to create jobs in rural areas. So in the very small time I have available, I hope I've been able to argue that in fact the rural-urban migration that we're seeing in Ukraine, in Crimea, and throughout the Black Sea region actually brings substantial economic benefits that we can capitalize on.